Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Daily Fantasy Digest Podcast, the all-inclusive podcast where we talk all things fantasy sports to help give you an edge. I'm your host, Joe Bewer, and I'm coming at you guys today with another interview. Today I have a very special guest. Today we're going to be talking some football, a little bit different from what we've been doing on this podcast lately with baseball season currently in effect. I have Matt Harmon with me, football analyst over at Yahoo Sports. I'm really excited to have Matt on the podcast today. I think he's going to bring some really great analysis for everybody that's about to start with fantasy football. So Matt, how's it going?
Oh man, it's so good. Thank you so much for having me. And I think it's perfect too. Like I work with a lot of baseball diehards here on our fantasy product team. You know, the people that go into designing the great Yahoo fantasy app and everything. A lot of baseball diehards that are constantly upset with my need to talk about how much, I just love football, no baseball, like all that. So I think me coming in and disrupting your baseball schedule actually works pretty perfectly for what I do every day here at work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's been a very long grind for this baseball season so far. I'm really excited to get a little bit of a break and kind of talk something a little bit different here. So before we go ahead and get into all the football talk, just to give everybody a little bit of history, how you came up, where it all started with DFS for you, and kind of how you landed to where you are now.
Yeah, so I mean, I've been playing fantasy football, I guess, really, since I was like in early high school. I think my sophomore year of high school was my first year playing fantasy. And then, I kind of started coming up in the fantasy industry, like as a writer and as an analyst, really when DFS started kind of exploding. So my first year really trying to pursue this as a career was the 2013 season. So that's when, like DraftKings and FanDuel were first starting to kind of percolate and really, become something that was clearly a game changer in the industry. So I started kind of writing at Football Guys as a freelancer, years like back in that 2013 season. And I really started off doing my own blog, a little bit of things on the side, and then talking about fantasy and DFS at Football Guys as a freelancer. And what really got me noticed by Football Guys and then continued to push me up through my career was my methodology that I developed to evaluate the wide receiver position and try to quantify route running, which is reception perception. And if you just use a hashtag reception perception on Twitter, you'll find a lot of that information. But that got me noticed more throughout the industry. Eventually ended up landing with NFL Network about 4 years ago now. And then I was there for 3 years before last year, made the move over here to Yahoo. And of course, like that kind of brought DFS back into my analysis landscape because we have a good game here and everything like that. And we made a big DFS push at the end of last season. And of course, now more good things to come this year here with Yahoo and Daily Fantasy. So yeah, I mean, I've been focused in the space now. This will be my fourth season doing this, or excuse me, my fifth season doing this full-time professionally. And I could not be more excited.
Do you do any podcasts? Any is it just mainly blogging, or is it not anything at all? Just strictly analytics for Yahoo?
Oh, I mean, at Yahoo, it's everything, like there's obviously writing, a couple columns every week. I'm debuting a new series this coming week, kind of tracking like buzzy players during the preseason. But yeah, so plenty of written work, but I have a podcast every week. We'll go 2 times a week here soon. It's me and Liz Loza, another one of the analysts here at Yahoo. And we kind of try to bring a little bit of a different flavor than every other podcast out there. A little bit more sass, a little bit more fun. So we have a good time on there. And then of course we have a lot of video content coming out of fantasy here with Yahoo, especially Fantasy Football Live every Sunday morning, where we can give you all the great updates that you're going to need heading into that week. And there's so much video content coming out of this place that it's almost hard to keep track. So yeah, man, I'm doing a little bit of everything now. I came in the industry initially just as a writer and an editor. But now, on doing things on camera, doing things on the podcast. I mean, that's the thing. If you're trying to get into this space as a full-time professional, you've got to be able to do a little bit of everything. You can't just be a writer. You can't just be on radio. You have to be able to chip into everything.
Right. So this is a question I ask everybody on the podcast because it's actually a really interesting question for me. So before I ask you the question, do you play a lot of like DFS, or is Yahoo restrict your ability to like play DraftKings or FanDuel or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, we're really only supposed to play internal private contests with like other coworkers here. We're
Okay.
not, yeah, we're not allowed to be because just as especially overall Yahoo Sports, we want to, maintain that integrity. We want to, not have any sort of insider stuff. So we're pretty strict about what type of public contests we're allowed to play. And yeah, pretty much it's just limited to private internal contests with other employees. So we have a big Slack channel here where there's a lot of private contests going out. So yeah, I'm not out there playing in a bunch of the leagues simply
Yeah.
for for professional reasons.
Yeah. So are you strictly football, or do you dabble in baseball and basketball just for fun with, other
I
people?
dabble a little bit in basketball because I like the sport and I like just the culture of the NBA is so much fun. It's definitely the most like social media engaging sport.
For sure.
There's just so many good storylines that come out of it. So I did dabble with a little bit of basketball, but I was really bad. So I mean, because I put it this way, man, like football takes up such an absurd amount of my time and also therefore my brain power that like if I start to try to bring in other sports into it, I feel like I'd start to forget, like my name, my address, my parents' phone.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that I mean I'm definitely I like other sports. I'm interested like also like DFS like golf always seemed to really appeal to me like as something pretty simple to follow and kind of put together. Obviously you're just following, one golfer at a time.
Right.
So that's always appealed to me, but I've really mostly just dabbled in basketball outside of football.
Gotcha. So, you're the first person on this channel. I'm an avid DFS player, 7 years. Just launched this podcast about a month and a half ago. So, I've had probably about, I think you're like the 16th interview that I've had, and I've asked the same question in every interview. Do you think it's it's possible to sustain like a long term, like lifelong, like career in DFS?
You mean strictly playing or
See
also
that
kind of
well, answer both.
okay, well, I mean the if you're gonna also do analysis, I mean, look, I hope so because I mean I'm not just doing DFS analysis, but in terms of like the fantasy industry, I think things are only looking up for fantasy fantasy football, especially as a whole.
Right.
Because there's just so much content coming out. There's just so many like the audience just grows, the revenue grows, everything is growing in terms of fantasy football. I mean, a lot of what you're seeing now is like subscription sites too.
Yep.
Big move in the industry like Evan Silva and Adam Levitan just launched their own subscription based site. Was that a week ago they came out with the announcement and that's like starting to ramp up, and I think that's great and I think like hardcore players will always go for that. But with the audience continuing to grow, I think that really does benefit, places that are giving out free content, larger media outlets like Yahoo or NFL Network or whatever. Like, and I'm sure there will be subscription based models coming out of here soon too. I hear that buzzword thrown around all the time. So I mean, I think that the revenue in the industry is continuing to grow. So from a content perspective, yeah, I think it's totally possible to sustain a long term lifestyle, and hopefully this industry only continues to grow and not only makes the fantasy industry bigger, but just football media as a whole. You'd
Right.
be totally disingenuous. Like I can always tell if like just a straight football writer or analyst or personality, whatever, gets it based on how they talk about fantasy football. Because if you're like just a straight beat writer or like a regular NFL columnist and you think people aren't reading your work for fantasy, I mean, you're kidding yourself. So
Right. But
like that's just
if you try and quantify being able to strictly play and make like a revenue, it's impossible. Like I'm just gonna flat out say it's literally impossible.
yeah. I don't know. I've never tried. I know that some people that's all they do is they just play DFS but also make a little content. So yeah, I mean it seems like it would be pretty tough to try to like make a living off there. But
Right.
I have no idea because I've never tried and frankly like I don't really have the stones to
Yeah.
try
I
something
mean,
like that.
I would my whole thought process behind this whole thing that I'm doing right now is I love the game, I love the grind, I love the sweating when you're in a GPP, the whole thing. I love the whole idea of fantasy and whatnot. I don't think it's sustainable to do that, but I think it's sustainable if you were to add a few things. Like per se a content or anything like that. And I have a big project in the work. I'm rolling out a bunch of, fantasy apparel that I'm coming out with here very soon to kind of boost this. And then I went and I went ahead and I, took my own money and invested it into a free fantasy football league that is going to act as, a stream of content for this podcast to be able to do pre-draft, post-draft, stuff like that, to be able to have people on there and kind of treat it as my own sports center. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's really cool because this is what's so awesome about this right now is like we can have conversations like this. How are you making like everybody can make content now. It's
Right.
not it is not it's not a monopoly at this point. It's not just big media companies that can do this type of stuff. Like anybody can have a podcast. That's like when people ask me, and I get this question a lot because this is my job, and everybody wants to have a job. Not everybody, but a lot of people want to have a job where all they do is just BS about football all day. I feel very lucky that is my job. So when people ask me like, how do I get your job, or how do I get started being a writer or an analyst, I'm like, well, just get started, like just start your own podcast, start your own blog. Like everybody can do stuff like exactly what you're doing. It's just if you invest your time and definitely probably a little bit of money as well along the way, you're gonna be able to get out there and create stuff. And then social media, you hit me up the other day and said, hey, like, would you mind sharing this podcast post? Sure, like no problem. And that just creates that connectivity, keeps us all kind of intertwined. And I think that's really cool. That's how you just grow and you spread it, and you take this cool stuff that you're working on and bring it to a larger audience. That's
Right.
what just is really cool about this day and
I
age.
think there's no positivity left in this daily fantasy world here, and I'm trying to bring a little bit back of like, hey guys, like we can all just like help each other out. Like, yeah, you may have a
Yeah.
little more followers than me, but like, hey, let's just reach out. Like, I'm gonna return the favor at some point. I'm gonna launch this apparel. I'm gonna send you a package. Like, I'm gonna be that guy, and I'm gonna try and like, help the people that have helped me, and that's exactly why I think that like, people. I read a statistic that 70% of podcasts don't make it to episode 10.
Huh.
And
Wow.
it's insane to me because right now this is episode 51.
Wow.
So, it's a grind. Have I grown a little bit? Yeah. Has I breaking out? Not really. But it's going to happen. And, having other people and, like growing friendships and stuff like that, just helping in this situation is really what's going to, kind of propel that forward. And I think a lot of people do the same thing. Do you know how many lineup providers and people do
Yeah.
breakdowns exactly like I do? I mean, yeah, am I setting the game? Am I doing something different with breakdowns? Not really, but I'm trying to create myself as a personality and then do this fantasy thing on the side that nobody does. Nobody's going to put out their own cash and just give away free money and stuff like this in a fantasy football league. It's just not what people do nowadays.
You're totally right. And yeah, I mean, that's the thing. When you're just getting started, there's anybody can look at rankings. I did a podcast for a while. It also made it into the 50s in terms of episodes. So I was not one of those that was after episode 2, episode 10. It's called the Backyard Banter Podcast, which basically just went and like interviewed people in the industry and said like, hey, how did you get started? How did you get your job? Sort of, to learn about people in the industry, but also to provide kind of that roadmap for people that wanted to have jobs like we did. And one of the first episodes was with JJ Zacharyson from Number Fire, and he was saying that yeah, like when you aren't established, like nobody cares about your rankings, or no one cares what you think about players because you're just another person. Like we all can have rankings, we all can have opinions, but I think how you treat people and the uniqueness of your content, as you're mentioning, that's what makes you stand out to people. That's what makes people remember you. So I think you're on the right track there.
I appreciate that because I'm like as much as everybody thinks this is a grind, it's like it's something that like we all love. Like everybody loves sports. I've had this image set in my mind of quitting the desk job that I currently work at to do this. And
Yeah.
like do something constructive like this that's sustainable. So I think it's really cool like to hear your kind of story and how you came up and how you landed the gigs you got. Like it's like inspirational, to be honest, to be like you like you said, most people would dream to have the job that you have. It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. Like I would be doing what I do anyways, I'd be thinking about football. I'd be thinking about projections. I'd be talking about games. Now I just get paid to do it,
Right.
which is nice.
Which is
And
awesome.
and I, yeah, and I like look. It could have been anybody. It happened to me, but it can happen to if you get lucky and if you work hard and you treat people well and you put out unique, interesting content. Like people are going to notice you. And I always say it's tough to get it's easy to get into the house. Like it's not hard to get into the house of the fantasy industry because there's so much. We're talking like there's so much content out there. There's so many sites that are employing writers. If it's just from like a small freelance perspective or whatever, or you can be out there doing your own thing. I mean, there's so many opportunities. It's a little more difficult to get a seat at the table. Like
Right.
you can get into the house, but you got to get a seat at the table, like a full-time job that this is all you do, whatever. That's difficult. I'm very lucky that I have one of those. And I'm not trying to give my seat up, but like that's the thing is that
Yeah, I
it's
know.
always
I
the table's always getting bigger. The entryways are always getting larger, like because again, there's just so much content out there right now. So there's a place for everybody as long as you work hard, you treat people well, and you make unique and interesting content, and people are hungry for it. So
I know. I definitely feel like getting in that circle of respectable people in the community is pretty vital. I think it's definitely something that is like almost a must-have to be sort of on your way up in the community.
yep.
So, with that being said, you know, your whole story is incredible. I want to now pick your brain and go against my brain and see kind of how we feel when it comes to fantasy football. I'm not gonna give away too many of my tricks because people might be watching this who are in the league that I'm in for the $500. But I'm interested to know your strategy going into like a draft because I'm not gonna talk from a DFS perspective. I want to talk strictly fantasy football. Like if you're about to do a draft for a league, what are you looking at? What are you targeting? Like what's your main goal like for second round?
Yeah, I mean, I think this year there's so much consensus about there's so much consensus about the top four picks. There's Saquon Barkley, Ezekiel Elliott, Alvin Kamara, and Christian McCaffrey. That's kind of the consensus top four picks right now, and that makes a lot of sense. And I think you can kind of mix those guys up depending on what you want.
Right.
And then it gets kind of interesting after that. The rest of the running backs. The only other running back I really like in the first round this year, outside of those guys, is David Johnson because of just the play volume that I think is coming to Arizona, his skill set. But then you're looking at wide receivers there. But I think what's really interesting is being able to start this year with one of those top four running backs in the top four picks, and then coming back in that second, third round turn. And then you're looking at a lot of really high end wide receivers. You're looking at AJ Green potentially being there, which is crazy because despite all the injuries, AJ Green passing volume wise and still his dominant skill set, he's still a guy that you can imagine a top five ceiling for.
Right.
And also then you can double back in the third round and get like a Stephon Diggs, Adam Thielen type of player. And there's a lot of appeal to that.
I agree because for me, just like in my personal opinion, I have a very strong opinion about how great of a player and how great of a fantasy player Christian McCaffrey is going to be this year. I think last year was like just the beginning. I think the screening ability, his receiving ability out of the backfield, and even the strength in the offseason that he's been accumulating is just going to only allow him to really just destroy anybody in his way. Because if we kind of look at the whole depth chart, there's not much in the way of wide receivers for Carolina right now. So I feel like McCaffrey is going to carry an absolute incredible amount of volume this year.
Yeah, I think the volume is there. I think the skill set is there. Like it's funny that we were last year looking at like, is Christian McCaffrey a guy that can run between the tackles? And I mean, yeah, the answer is obviously yes. I was a believer in him coming out of school, and then what we're looking at now is great. Actually, the guy that really appeals the most to me, and I don't hear a lot of people talking about him as the 1.01 pick, but I think Alvin Kamara is my favorite of those four backs because you're looking at probably the best offense of the four, I think, with New Orleans there. And it's also a highly concentrated offense. And this it's kind of like what you're talking about with Christian McCaffrey. Although I really like the two receivers in Carolina this year. They're young, they're unproven, but I think DJ Moore and Curtis Samuel have breakout potential. But in New Orleans, it's really Michael Thomas, and then not much else. Some veteran guys, an unproven guy in Traquan Smith who is coming into his second year. Jared Cook is there, but that I think volume is going to flow a lot through Kamara in the backfield, and beyond him, there's just not much else. So I think that he could be a guy that catches 80 to 100 passes this year, and then also is still a dynamic rusher. And with Mark Ingram gone, I think they only continue to lean on him more. And what we saw with Drew Brees at the end of last year was that he was starting to slip from a passing game perspective. I think that only makes Kamara more of the figurehead in this offense. So I think the fact that it could be the best scoring unit while also being more focused on him, he's a guy that if I have the first overall pick, I don't mind taking there.
Right. I think that I was definitely, in terms of, the New Orleans offense, I was definitely a big Michael Thomas guy last year. And I think
Yeah.
that this year I'm off of that, just in my own personal opinion. I know the passing is there, and I know it's always going to be there, but I've switched focus more to, if I can, DeAndre Hopkins or Julio Jones, and potentially my top three personal is definitely got to be Devontae Adams. Those three guys are pretty like key and vital to their respected offenses, and I think it's very it's if you can get one of those guys, I feel like you're on the right track.
Yeah, Devontae Adams is my top rated receiver coming into this year because, again, look at the construction of the rest of the offense. Like, obviously, Aaron Rodgers is there. And then beyond Devontae Adams, you have a lot of unproven talent. I think there's some potential with guys like Marquez Valdez-Scantling, with Geronimo Allison, but we don't really know quite what they'll be yet. That could really lead Adams to be a guy who leads the NFL in targets this year. And if you're already a proven elite player and you're getting targets from an elite player like Aaron Rodgers, and that volume might actually get boosted because you're just clearly the most proven asset there, I think that's huge for him. And Hopkins, again, you're splitting hairs here. You're making small decisions. But with Hopkins, you got to look at, he's tied to a great quarterback in Deshaun Watson. He's an absolute monster, but Kiki Cutie kind of came on towards times of last year, as a slot receiver. I think he could inherit some volume. Will Fuller is coming back from injury, but he's a proven difference maker when he's on the field. Like, if you're betting on who's going to have more targets this year, I think from just an offensive construction perspective, I think Adams is probably the favorite over Hopkins right now.
Yeah, I think another really dark horse player for an increased amount of targets, assuming that quarterback stays healthy, is Juju Smith-Schuster. With Antonio Brown out, I was on him heavy last year, and he ended up putting up a pretty good year. But with Antonio Brown gone and that increased volume, I think he could potentially, you could see him at the tail end of a first round pick.
I totally think so, and a lot of my concerns about Pittsburgh without Antonio Brown, because it's one thing to say okay, there's a lot of volume available, within the offense, but Antonio Brown is such a difference maker. He's a guy who dictates coverages. He plays that outside X receiver position. That's not a position that we've seen Juju play this year. What I think, or that we've ever seen him play at the NFL level, he operates as that big slot receiver. And I think that really is still going to help him volume wise. I think he could easily catch 100 passes and score, 9 to 10 touchdowns, and clearly pushes that first round worthy conversation. I'm not worried about his production, but what I think Pittsburgh needs to happen is, one of these outside receivers like a Dante Moncrief or a James Washington to really step up and inherit that volume, or even Deontay Johnson, the rookie third rounder they drafted this year. He's a guy that I think we need to see step up. Somebody needs to step up as an outside receiver in order to keep the offensive efficiency afloat, because I don't know that they can just operate as a middle of the field passing game with just Juju and Vance McDonald. I think we have to see either Moncrief or Washington step up on the outside.
Right, and I think it's exciting because if they do end up figuring it out, I think Juju could be a very top, dark horse receiver that not a lot of people are really on, and that's something that I'm willing to capitalize on, especially even if it ends up being a third round pick or late second round for me. But there's been some controversy, especially with the people that I've been speaking with. Keenan Allen coming into this year, what are you really expecting of him? Because we've seen, in past years, Keenan Allen go early second round. A lot of people have him projected third round, which is a little interesting for me, especially with Phillip Rivers and how high of a passing offense and actually how high of a rated offense they're intended to be this year.
Yeah, and especially if Melvin Gordon, I don't think Melvin Gordon's going to end up missing any games, but theoretically, if he did with this holdout, um, you're looking at a situation where I think the Chargers have to throw more because right now they do want to be more of a run-based team, but without Melvin Gordon back there, I think they're going to end up pushing the ball into the air a little bit more than you would expect if Gordon was there. So that's just another layer of it. But even without that, yeah, this is a good offense. It's a good quarterback, and Keenan Allen is a proven high-volume receiver. So I don't have any problems clicking his name, in the third round. And again, that's where the meat of this draft really is for wide receivers. The third round, you can easily see yourself ending up with somebody like T.Y. Hilton, A.J. Green, Keenan
Yep.
Allen, Adam Thielen, Stephon Diggs. Like, that's really an appealing group of players
That's
to be
crazy,
taking.
to be honest, because they were first round picks last year.
Right. And the fact that you can get two of them
Yes.
theoretically if at the 2-3 round turn, it's really exciting. It's an
So
exciting year to be drafting receivers high.
exactly, because there's one team that I want to touch on. I want to see your take on the impact of the addition of Demaryius Thomas into New England, and how that you think that's going to impact Julian Edelman. Because Demaryius Thomas, back when he used to play with the Broncos and Peyton Manning, was kind of a very dynamic receiver, almost, he was just a go up and grab it type of receiver. So I'm interested to see how they're going to incorporate him in, to this sort of offense, because as they had Josh Gordon last year, it didn't really do too much for them. Obviously despite the drug abuse, but yeah.
Yeah, let's see if Demaryius Thomas makes the team. Because at this point he's aging, he's coming off an Achilles injury. That's a tough ask for a receiver his age. But the thing with New England, like they have a lot of receiving opportunity up for grab. We know Gronk is gone. We think he could always pop. Yeah, I think there's a chance Gronk, comes back for like a playoff run or something like that. But assuming going into the season that he's not coming back, it really is just Julian Edelman and not a lot of proven bodies at that outside receiver spot. So if someone like a Demaryius Thomas makes the team, or even if Josh Gordon, because there are rumblings that he could get reinstated, that the Patriots are actually kind of planning on him being reinstated and coming back, that would be a huge difference maker for them. Because again, as I said, they need that outside receiver position pretty badly right now. So you're right to kind of keep an eye on that position. I wonder if we've already kind of seen the end of Demaryius Thomas's career, but the fact that he's on the roster, it's at least something to keep an eye on.
Right. So one thing I do want to ask, is your primary focus in round one? Are you basing your selection on running back or wide receiver based on what pick you have? I'm assuming. If you take a wide receiver, if you end up taking a wide receiver first round, are you doubling it back with another one and then a running back, or running back then another wide receiver?
So yeah, definitely like where I'm drafting in the first round impacts who I'm thinking about because, like I said, there's a consensus on those top four running backs. They have to be the first four picks, I think, pretty much in every draft. I think David Johnson should be the 1.05 pick. And then when you're at 6 and 7, then you start to ask questions about, look, if you're someone that believes in Le'Veon Bell, then you can think about it there. I'm probably going to go with a receiver like Adams or Hopkins there. Some people will even take Kelsey in the first round, and that's fine. So really it's just it's who do you it is where do you pick? And then the question though, as I've said, like round 2, round 3, there's so many good receivers available, and the fact that you can double up on them is great. The only thing that you do have to keep in mind is I think more than ever this year, the running backs in rounds 5 through 8 are rough to look at. There's not really one guy in that group that I love.
Come on, man. You don't like Marlon Mack?
Marlon Mack's a fine pick, but Marlon Mack is going like third round. So
I know. Last year I had him like 7th or 8th.
Yeah, right. Like that was great. This year, you're looking at names like Tevin Coleman's the guy who stands out to me in that group, and that is a totally unpredictable backfield. Like
Yeah.
I'm not in on Darius Geis. I'm not in on Rashad Penny. I like
Tariq
the idea.
Cohen?
Like Tariq Cohen, yeah, but like you're not getting a lot of touchdown upside there because I think David Montgomery is obviously the guy who's going to lead the team in carries and be the red zone player.
Yeah.
You're taking bets on
You're
players
getting
like,
yardage with Cohen. That's what you're getting.
yeah. I think James White is appealing there because we mentioned, that there's not a lot of receiving options in New England right now that should theoretically benefit James White. But, the rest of the guys there, Rashad Penny, Darrell Henderson, Latavius Murray, Miles Sanders, like you're going to have to tell yourself a pretty convincing story as to how that guy ends up being like an RB2 type player. Like they have paths there, but they are not clear paths. So
Right.
I do think and the wide receiver is so deep this year that there are players in round 6 to 8 that I think could be breakout guys. So
Right.
you have to ask yourself that question. I do really love the idea of getting 2 top end wide receivers rounds 2 and 3, but are you then willing to take risks and bets in
Right.
rounds 5 through 8 with running
I
backs?
mean, I'm looking at one of the mock drafts that I just did recently, just so I could see something as far as what positions were taken. It was 10 running backs and 2 wide receivers. So, Adams and Hopkins went picks 7 and 8. In this draft, in the first round, Melvin Gordon, Joe Mixon, Todd Gurley, and James Conner were the last 4 picks. And I want to get your take on that because for me, I have Derrick Henry over Joe Mixon.
Oh, I like that because I really like Derrick Henry. I would probably have Mixon over Henry, but just because I think Mixon has more passing game involvement to boost his weekly floor. But Derrick Henry is such an appealing pick to me in like the round 2 to 3 range. That turn there because
Right.
he's such a monster for one. Like I think he's an incredible, like breathtaking player to watch. And I think they really, their offensive coordinator just said that they want to build the offense around him. They want to ride him here in his contract year. And I think he's up to the task. I think this offense operated clearly at its best last year when it was revolving around Derrick Henry. So I'm with you that I love him as a pick this
Right.
year.
Because, I mean, my draft went DeAndre Hopkins, pick number 1, doubled it back with Derrick Henry at the end of the second round. And then third round had AJ Green. So those are my top 3 for draft. I was not as super happy with the way that it turned out, but just with what was it's between AJ Green, Adam Thielen, and like Julian Edelman, and I enjoy AJ Green's volume. So, but I mean,
if you got AJ Green as your wide receiver too, you're doing good things.
Exactly.
Like that's pretty good.
But for me, I went with Derrick Henry over Nick Chubb. And I'm always going to take that bet. I can't gauge Chubb's own, like his volume with Kareem Hunt there. I can't gauge that yet. I mean, nobody knows. So it's really hard for me to really gauge that because, the pick before that, I wanted Damian Williams from Kansas City. I think he's going to be incredible this year. But, I don't see Derrick Henry being too bad at a running back option if you have Hopkins and A.J. Green as your 2 top receivers.
Yeah, I agree. And it's really all about like making your running back and receiver picks complement each other. So if you're taking sure bets at receiver, you could take a little bit of risk. You could take a little bit of risk there with your running back selection.
Exactly. I mean, I rated my drafting ability in that draft at like a 6. So, I mean, it wasn't the greatest thing ever. But the last question I have before, I let you go here is where do you start looking at quarterbacks? What round?
It kind of depends on how the board falls, but I'm really not thinking about it until, round 8 or 9. And again, that depends on how the board falls, and even there, it's got to be the right player. Like if Carson Wentz gets to round 8 or 9, I'm thinking about it. I'm tempted by Kyler Murray this year. I'll be honest with you, in that range, just because I know obviously he's a rookie, but the running ability is huge. I think the offense in Arizona will be voluminous from a play calling perspective. So it really depends on the quarterback, and it depends on the type of league. If it's a best ball league, I'll kick that can way down the road because you can just, kind of cobble together a quarterback carousel late in your drafts and really continue your picks at running back and wide receiver to continue like the better odds of a hit rate. So the opportunity cost is huge. But I'm really just not going to think about it in rounds, 1 through 7, to be honest, even if the right player falls.
Right, because I mean, in that Kyler Murray perspective, I'm pretty heavy on Lamar Jackson this year.
Yeah.
I think he's going to be great with that running ability, and I also think Baker Mayfield's going to have a great year. But I do I have seen. I mean, they have Mahomes going fifth round. Like that's like a common trend here. I don't see that being reliable.
No, I mean in a league with analysts, anything is possible because I think we're all agreed that like you should draft your quarterbacks late. We've beat it into our heads here
Yeah.
over the last several years, so you will see crazy quarterback values in leagues like that. I was in a mock draft with analysts a couple like about a month ago, and I got the Aaron Rodgers in round 9. That's never ever happening in
No.
a real person draft. So it's like not even really actionable information to tell people that. So yeah, I mean, you're just typically never going to see Mahomes. I did in one best ball draft take Mahomes in round 4 when he fell there because again he fell to round 4, and also like again I'm looking at running back bets that I don't like. No receiver value is on the board that I like, so I took Mahomes there. But that's number one. It's in a best ball situation, and number two, it's round 4. Like, give me a break.
Exactly. I mean, in that perspective, I just don't. I think quarterback. I mean, I'm not looking at the quarterback position until late on. But I think that I think the tight end position is going to be pretty tight this year.
Yes.
And it's really, really slim pickings. If you don't get Kelsey and you don't get Kittle, I think you're really kind of searching for any bit of leeway when it comes to that position.
Well, usually it's actually interesting because I think usually like there are a couple late round, Kelsey and Kittle are great examples of guys that in previous years were these athletic late round tight ends that, were sleeper picks that like the entire fantasy industry was on. Those guys don't really exist this year because they're actually boosted up into like the mid rounds. OJ Howard and Hunter Henry and kind of Evan Ingram a little bit, but he's actually had a high volume season. Those are the two guys this year, the athletic freaks that everybody expects to break out, but like they're going round 5 and 6. So those late round guys don't really exist this year. So you kind of have to just make that decision to yourself. Like, tight end is so gross after those top 3 guys, and but you have to pay up for the potential breakout players.
Right.
Otherwise then otherwise then you're asking yourself like, am I really going to be the person that takes frickin' Jared Cook in the 7th round?
Oh man.
I don't know that I want to be that person.
No, you might have to be, man. It's the year of David Carr. You didn't hear?
Yeah,
Or Derek
terrific.
Carr. Yeah, it's the year of freaking Derek Carr when it comes to Antonio Brown, man. He's going to make him look like the best quarterback in the league. But yeah, I mean, I appreciate you, taking the time to come on here and talk some fantasy football talk with me. It's the first time having this on the podcast. Really think it's important to give the viewers and somebody, something to go off of from somebody who does this for a living. Kind of what you're thinking going through the rounds, and where you see picking certain positions in rounds. I think people have to understand that it's a little different. If you're playing in a league with your buddies, half the times Mahomes is going to go second round. Like, it's just what it is. But I mean, if you're playing in a serious money league, this is where you kind of take this sort of advice and kind of run with it. But I really do appreciate you coming on the podcast. Everybody who's listening here, please go ahead and head on Twitter and follow Matt on Twitter at Matt Harmon _BYB. Crazy analyst over at Yahoo Sports, does incredible work. I would recommend checking out any of the articles that he writes and following him on Twitter, just staying up to date with anything that he tweets. You'll be able to use it in some way, shape, or form. So yeah, Matt, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I'll touch base with you after this. I'd like to send you some free podcast swag, just kind of show my appreciation for you coming on the podcast, if you're cool with that.
Hey, man, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it. It was a blast talking with you. I'm excited about football season, so it's good to break it down, man.
Yeah, so am I. Maybe we'll get in a league together at some point in the future here. But for everybody listening, subscribe if you haven't already, and follow Matt on Twitter and follow this podcast on Twitter at Fantasy Digest _ big things coming. And go like the pin tweet on Twitter if you want to enter the fantasy league. Do have a few spots open because a couple people backed out. So go ahead and check that out. And yeah, I appreciate Matt coming on and everything that you do over at Yahoo Sports. It's incredible. So make sure you follow him and stay up to date with everything that's going on with the podcast as well. And we'll see you guys next time on the Daily Fantasy Digest podcast.